Okay, welcome to the Gut Club's. I don't know, what is this, our seventh installment of our new podcast. Today, we have a very wild ride for you. We're going to be treading very deep water. We're going to be talking about the vaginal microbiome with the head of science for Ombre, Kimberly Griffith. Welcome. Welcome to the Gut Club.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks for having me.
Kimberly is the head of science. That's a big that's a that's a big title. The head of science. Tell us what your background is, Kimberly.
Yeah, so I've probably been in microbiome research about 10 years. I got into functional medicine, started working with clients about 8 years ago, 7 years ago, and working on those with metabolic imbalances, autoimmune diseases, and really went back to the microbiome a lot of the times. We worked on modulating the biome, the gut biome, but also the oral biome. And then when I worked with females, when it came to pregnancy and such, we worked on the vaginal microbiome as well.
Wow. What's your background? How did you become a microbiome expert? Where did you learn all this?
So I got my master's in functional medicine and human nutrition, and I studied under Dr. Jason Harlock and as in the microbiome classes, and I absolutely fell in love. It just made sense. And when it comes to epigenetics, there's not a lot of information out there about how big a role the microbiome plays. And then I just dove straight in.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, how long has Ombre had the vaginal microbiome test out? That's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be going over the test. The Gut Club is an affiliate of Ombre. We've been promoting the gut microbiome test of Ombre's for a number of years now. Even going back to the transition when the company was named Thrive. So it's probably been about 5 years that we've been working with that stool test. And I have to say, it's a great platform. It offers so much information. I just love the idea that people can now receive an inventory of their microbiome from the bacterial standpoint and receive a very broad overview of the bacterial biome, which is suggestive of really a multi-kingdom health as well. But the vaginal test, how long has that been out?
Almost about 2 years now. People are not as familiar with the vaginal microbiome as they are with the gut.
Yeah.
But looking at the research, we know that the gut microbiome has an effect on our overall health or disease development. And the
Yeah.
vaginal microbiome is the same. We just need to get the word out there, how important it is for women to kind of monitor it and take their health into their own hands and see what's going on. Much like the gut microbiome, when it's internal, we don't necessarily see inflammation or pro-inflammatory bacteria, how they're affecting us until it manifests into outward symptoms like skin imbalances or GI issues. Same with the vaginal microbiome. We may not necessarily know that we're in elevated risk for infections such as STIs or pelvic inflammatory disease, because until it develops, we don't have any knowledge of it. But if you monitor it and test it, you can kind of see what bacteria is dominating and the inflammation within.
Yeah, it would be great if we could organize some hospital demonstration programs to make these tests routine, both the gut microbiome test and the vaginal health test. I mean, there's, these things should be done obviously in pregnancy, because this subject matter is also associated with preterm birth and even fertility. I mean, and things like viral bacterial interaction as well. This is such a broad subject. I mean, that's why I said we're going to be treading very deep water today. And if I make any poor attempts at humor, it's mainly because it's such a daunting subject. And, so anyway, I'll be the one asking the silly questions. I'm Keith Bell, by the way. I'm the founder of the Gut Club. I should have introduced myself in the beginning. So anyway, why don't we dive into what the test looks like? Before we do that, let me ask you a simple question. The test has been out for a couple of years. Have you noticed doctors embracing this test? I mean, are gynecologists typically ordering vaginal microbiome tests these days?
It really, we do see, certain gynecologists ordering the test, those that are more familiar with the vaginal microbiome and how it could be contributing to certain signs and symptoms, instead of just giving an antibiotic to knock out, bacterial vaginosis. Those that want to work on a more natural avenue, we do see that. But much like the gut, not everybody is aware of the effect. So
Yeah, yeah, I hear you.
educating.
Yeah. You know, the title of this talk, by the way, is going to be Lactobacillus, Guardians of Humanity. Because what's fascinating is that lactobacilli, are dominant by far in the healthy vaginal microbiome or bacterial biome. Why that is, we don't really understand, because there is also research showing that other mammals do not have lactobacillus dominance in their vaginal biome, which is fascinating to consider because they do have very high levels of lactobacilli in the gut. So, maybe later, if there's time, we can talk about translocation. We can also talk at another time, hopefully, we do a part 2 about various remedies and things like, the latest research on vaginal microbiota transplant. Massachusetts General Hospital is doing a lot of amazing research and giving women hope, actually, using vaginal fluid transplants. There's just so much that we're only going to be able to scratch the surface today. So today we'll focus on what the actual tests are about, and then maybe at the end we'll dabble a little bit. But I like to think of lactobacilli as the guardians of humanity, and here we are with a toxic environment, basically our own worst enemy, if we are hurting our lactobacillus. And this also comes down to even issues like tryptophan metabolism and glyphosate and fungal overgrowth, because lactobacillus are able to control fungi. I mean, there's so much. There's iron metabolism, anemia related to whether or not lactobacilli can be dominant, and that's such a prevalent issue. But why don't we share screens? I want to show people what the test is about, and the first thing I want to show people is this is our main hub on the Gut Club Facebook page. We also have the Gut Club stool test discussion group. This is on our main page, however. For anyone out there, please join the Gut Club stool test discussion group. You do not have to have stool test results or vaginal microbiome test results to join our group. It is a private group, however. We've got about 10,000 people there now, and a few thousand quite active and brilliant. I started the group in 2015 just so I can learn from other people, and I do on a daily basis. But this is where we're posting a lot of information about the vaginal microbiome. This happens to be a study about probiotics that were found to help the lactobacilli probiotics, but not actually vaginal strains of lactobacilli. So this is about the crosstalk between the gut, basically, and vaginal flora, and how things like metabolism play a role. Even oxygenation. There's fascinating research with exercise and vaginal flora. And of course, diet. But let's talk about Ombre's report, and then we'll show an actual report. Before we do that, though, people need to know that there are 5 vaginal community state types. Why don't you walk us through these, Kimberly?
Yes. So the vaginal microbiota is quite different from the gut in that, based on the research, we see that women tend to cluster into 5 different, what we call community state types. I will say there's a lead researcher, Jack Ravel, that has done so many studies and has provided so much insight into the vaginal microbiome that it's worth just looking at some of his studies when you have a chance. But I think he was the one that first did, I think it was 400 women across 5 ethnic groups, and he found that they tend to cluster into 5 what we call community state types. The first community state type is dominated by Lactobacillus crispatus. This is the bacteria that creates both D-lactic acid and L-lactic acid. So it really does a good job at keeping pathogens out. It does not like to cohabitate. It doesn't really want a lot of other bacteria around. And it's really the most, based on the research, the most protective community state type.
Wow. I've seen some studies showing the differences in races in vaginal flora, but then I've also seen contradicting newer reports showing that it's not so simple, and it might come down to antibiotics. Or even things like vaginal douching practices.
Right.
Even the playing field among the races. I used to think so strongly there could be a microbial predisposition based on race. I don't think that so much. As of the last couple of days, I'm starting to go back on that. Okay, so community state type 1 is Lactobacillus crispatus dominant.
Yes.
What other kinds of microbes might we see in a report?
Well, you'll see which bacteria is dominating your ecosystem. So when we have Lactobacillus crispatus dominating, there are very few other ones. Some of the other community state types, like community state type 3 is Lactobacillus iners. That is not a very protective community state type because Lactobacillus iners only creates L-lactic acid, which is not as strong as D-lactic acid. So you will see those Gardnerella pop up, Prevotella, some of those other possible pathogens that can create biofilms and grow a little bit stronger, where they wouldn't do that as well in Lactobacillus crispatus environment.
Okay, it's fascinating to consider that the major phyla of the gut are also found in the vaginal flora, and I've been focusing a lot on what may be considered the most immune modulating, and that's Bacteroides. And it's interesting to consider Bacteroides also as a part of the vaginal community. Do you see that also a lot in results?
Yes, Fragilis we see a lot.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah, that's a very protective Bacteroides. There are enterotoxigenic forms, however, of that. Right. So it's interesting that we have to really split hairs when even from a species standpoint. But
they are at very low levels when we do see them, just when it's one of the community state types that's dominated by a Lactobacillus species.
I see. Again,
with the vaginal biome, that Lactobacillus species tends to dominate pretty high at like 70, 80, 89%. They dominate pretty well.
Wow, I've even seen 95%.
Right. Yeah.
In the literature, at least. I haven't seen that in an actual test yet, but 95%. Whereas in other mammals, it's like 1%. Go figure. Amazing.
It's
fascinating. That's probably the most unique, part of humanity. Other than large brains, and that may not be actually so unique.
And what I find just absolutely beautiful, everything about the microbiome, all the microbiomes just fascinate me and light me on fire. But, when women are pregnant, lactobacillus is fed up by estrogen. And we know pregnancy is a hyperestrogenic phase, right? And so those lactobacillus are really being nourished, which is what you want. You want a protective environment for the baby. And so it's just fascinating the way that biome works.
And there is literature suggesting that bacilli are the first colonizers, at least in preterm birth. So this is probably a matter of translocation from vaginal flora to the uterus, which is also shown in the research. Finding the evidence of translocation from the gut to vaginal flora is another story. That's That's fascinating. Okay, let's move on to community state type 2.
Sure. So community state type 2 is going to be Lactobacillus gasseri. This produces a higher level of L-lactic acid and a lower level of D-lactic acid, but it does produce both. So this is another protective environment, not as protective as L. crispatus based on the literature, but it is very protective as well.
Okay.
Doesn't normally dominate as high as crispatus. Just as I mentioned, crispatus seems to dominate very, very high. So
Interesting. And in the literature previously, that was shown to be also a matter of race. Someone from India, for instance, might be more naturally dominant in L inners. But let's see, community state type 3. That's what that is. But I think the jury might still be out on that, as I mentioned. Tell us about. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say for ethnicity, the research does tend to go back and forth. The great part of this field is the research is ever evolving and coming out fast, which is encouraging for all of us that are a part of it and just love it. So, but Lactobacillus inners is a L-lactic acid only producing bacteria. So it's not as strong. We see, I think Jacques Rivel did another study on 160 women that had chlamydia. Most of them were in CST4, which we'll discuss, but there are a good amount in Lactobacillus inners, CST3, just because inners does not seem to be able to fight pathogens off as well as the other species. And it's probably the type of lactic acid it's producing.
Okay. You have to wonder who named this species, inners. The research, by the way, people might be interested to know that it goes back quite a long way. It's well over 100 years. Lactobacilli were found dominant by Dr. Doddelin, I believe is his name. I have a Dodeline. Here's a 1926 paper talking about his work in 1892. Probably the male scientists have been obsessed with this subject matter for well over 100 years. But these days, I think the best work is taking place at Brigham Young Hospital. Is it I'm sorry. We'll get back to that. They're the ones doing the not Brigham Young, the Massachusetts Hospital. Let's get back to it's Christine Mitchell. They're doing a lot of pioneering work on vaginal microbiota, and basically what's the equivalent of FMT, vaginal fluid transfer. The Motif program. We'll talk about that a little later. So community state type 3. We covered that.
Just went over 3 was inners. So then we go into community state type 4.
Yes.
And basically, community state type 4 is a non-lactobacillus dominating ecosystem. You tend to have high diversity, which that's one major difference between the gut microbiota compared to the vaginal. Gut microbiota research indicates high diversity contributes to health, right? But the vaginal, you want low diversity. And community state type 4 tends to have high diversity. Again, it does not have that lactobacillus dominating ecosystem, which means it's not as acidic. So that means that the pathogens are more comfortable there. And for women, this is our first line of the defense against a pathogen. Before the pathogen meets the vaginal epithelial lining, it has to meet those bacteria. So what type of bacteria you have is very important. Do you have a pit bull that's like, don't get in? Or do you have a sweet little chihuahua that's like, oh, come play with me? You want the vicious, strong species that's going to create an environment where pathogens don't want to get friendly.
Right. It's fascinating to consider that diversity is not all it's been cracked up to be. I mean, several years ago, that was being touted as the main thing, connected to ancestral microbiome, like the Hadza research, and the diversity was, skyrocketing compared to the developing world, and then I did some further research and discovered just also skyrocketing rates of infant and child mortality with such a diverse microbiome. I think it really comes down to, when we discuss diversity, we need to factor protective microbiota. And when it comes to vaginal flora, that's lactobacilli, again, the guardians of humanity. So we have this diverse microbiome state associated with vaginosis.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, Ombre is also offering things like probiotics and prebiotics. Are you applying those to try to balance those with type 4?
So whenever you take the test, you will be allocated to a certain community type based on the analysis from the sample. And then there will be a probiotic recommended based on which strains match the pathogens presenting, usually a community state type 4. There are very few probiotic strains that have shown to reach the vaginal biome and be able to survive there. We do use the strains that have the research behind them. But again, it's very much limited when you're doing an oral supplementation to treat the vaginal, to modulate the vaginal biome.
Interesting. Well, the crosstalk again is fascinating because just regular probiotic strains were found to regulate vaginal balance. So, things like iron metabolism as well. I mean, we know that lactobacilli are able to help with iron absorption, and this gets pretty deep. And I'm just learning about these things myself. Things like Prevotella overgrowth are also associated with fungi, and there's that's kind of a vicious triangle, if you will, regarding anemia as well. Have you seen high levels of Prevotella in vaginal flora tests like we do in the gut, where we're associating that with fungal metabolites?
We don't see it as high. We do see Prevotella species come up generally in CST4, but nowhere near, in gut, we can see it dominating at like 60% and higher. So it's not quite the same, but we do know, one of the modulators of the vaginal biome is the gut. We do know that a healthy gut microbiome tends to contribute to a healthy vaginal microbiome and increase those lactobacilli levels. So it is, it's the vaginal microbiome is important, but it's important to have a healthy gut microbiome because, like you said, that translocation, there is talk in between both of them.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the last category, the last CST.
So the last CST is Lactobacillus jensenii, and that is a D-lactic acid only producing bacteria, doesn't produce any L-lactic acid. It's protective as well. It's more protective than inners, not as protective as Lactobacillus crispatus. That one we don't see as many people fall into CST5. Generally, we see 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Okay.
But there are.
Okay. Here's a chart that puts it very succinctly all in one in one image you can eyeball. But basically, there's only one that's mainly disruptive. That's type 4. Although inners can also be problematic, apparently.
It can. Not only is it not as protective against those pathogens that we're exposed to, but it also, there's some research indicating that it can contribute to biofilm formation by Gardnerella. So I have not gone deep into the research on how that's the case, what's the mechanism of action, but we do seem to see that Lactobacillus inners is just not as protective. We like to say lactobacilli are very protective and create an acidic environment, but this one does not seem to create as protective as an environment as 1, 2, and 5.
Okay. All right. So this is the kind of information you would find in a report. We're going to also take a few minutes to go through some sample reports. Again, we're an affiliate of Ombre, and we're trying to spread the word here about this opportunity for women's health. which is actually human health, of course. So if you use our discount code, the Gut Club 20, you'll get 20% off. It works out to be about $79 for a test. So it's really quite a bargain. Here is a sample test for community state type 1. And online, you also have all this information, of course. And just like the gut test, you can also access the raw data, including FASTQ files, and look at the overall list of, it's basically an inventory of bacteria found in the bacterial biome, just like the gut test. But in this PDF, of course, we don't have the full list of microbes, but the kind of information that you would find. What's your favorite part of the report, Kimberly, if I were to ask you that question? What's the first thing you look at when you see a report?
Right here. I look at what's dominating right here.
Yeah.
The bacteria count. I'm a visual person, but I also love details.
Yeah.
So it's an easy overview of, we can see just by glancing at this, Lactobacillus crispatus is dominating this ecosystem. I did want to mention, when we talk about women testing, it's important to test outside your menses. During menses, oxygen levels go up and we see lactobacillus levels drop. So it won't give us an accurate representation of really what's going on, because after menses, those lactobacillus go back up and you get back to a normal state. So I do want to make sure women know that to test outside their menses, and you'll get a better, more accurate representation of what's dominating the ecosystem. But you can see, like, even if that does fluctuate some within the cycle, it's generally the species is dominating so much, you'll get an accurate representation of which CST you fall within.
Okay.
So,
very, very interesting. What amazing detective work that people can do these days. We never had this opportunity before the last, few years. I mean, so, this is really a revelation, and hopefully it will be embraced by the mainstream. I like to factor count when it comes to gut testing. That's one of the things that I look at, and in some tests they don't provide that. It's nice to see you're providing that in the vaginal test, because low counts are associated with disease states in the gut. I haven't seen the vaginal tests enough to know what might be considered a low count. When you see this count, 11,497, what does that say to you?
It's on the lower end. This was a older sample report. We tend to see higher numbers right now with the lab we're using, and you won't see as many species picked up within the report as you will see in gut.
Okay.
Like the gut is just a plethora of species, where vaginal is clearly you see a dominating species, and then you have some growing. But what's important to know is, like, are there any pathobionts or pathogens that may be contributing to, like, bacterial vaginosis? Like you said, we didn't have this years ago to look at, but if a woman is suffering from bacterial vaginosis, when they take antibiotics, usually there's relapse afterwards. We kind of go back, it may treat it for a moment, but it's going to go back to the same situation. So being able to know which pathogens or pathobionts are dominating and how you can naturally treat them is great for women. We do put within this report some of the causes based on the research for vaginal dysbiosis within the microbiome, which someone may not know. They may not know that certain hygiene practices are actually impeding the growth of lactobacilli. So we try to give them as much information as possible. Under the bacteria species, you'll see the actual percentage picked up. And then you'll also see content based on the research of what the research says about that bacteria. I think that's a little bit farther down.
Okay.
Right there. So we'll give you the type. Oh, sorry, go up a little bit. So like Lactobacillus crispatus, we'll give you the type, the description of it, your levels. What is not on this report is we also have associations. So there's an association. Does it contribute to vaginal health? Or say they're dominated by group B strep or something. It'll give associations like this bacteria is associated with preterm delivery or PID or bacterial vaginosis. And that's important information for women to have that they might not know if they weren't to test.
Yeah, I like seeing that it's also associated with viruses like HPV, as well as the HIV research. Lactobacilli are found to decrease the risk of contracting HIV, and lactobacilli are able to clear HPV. So that's kind of the dividing line. You know, most of humanity will in their lifetime be infected by these viruses, and the difference is whether or not you have the lactobacilli to clear the virus. I think it's well over 80% of people carrying HPV. Is that the figure these days? I have to.
And it's been a while since I looked at the research. Now I'm definitely gonna get off the call and look and follow back up with you. But yeah, that's what I think we tend to forget, is that we are exposed to pathogens all the time. Is how is our body and our bacteria fighting it? You know, when it comes to, like I said, that research on chlamydia, like those that had Lactobacillus crispatus, I think there were only 2 that were actually infected and the chlamydia got inside the cells. But with Lactobacillus CST4, it was a much higher level. So yeah, we are, like you said, we are exposed to it. It's do we have the mechanisms of action to fight it off? Yeah,
you're inspiring me to take a look at, you know, whether or not there's research regarding COVID and vaginal flora. I mean, that would not surprise us to see changes based on that virus. That's really, we're talking about real immunity here, folks. I mean, this is about having the flora able to regulate our immune response.
Right. And speaking, you know, when I talked about during menses, the lactobacillus drop and we're less protected, that's important information for women to have too, is to know when they're not protected, when, you know, they may be more susceptible to pathogens. And definitely during menses, that's a time that we see lactobacillus drop.
Yeah, fascinating. Let's look at the next report. This is type 5. This is the only other one we're going to go through today. But type 5, remind us again, that's
Lactobacillus jensenii.
Yes.
It's protective. It has that D-lactic acid. You know, I try to think of a little about, you know, D-lactic acid to me is like a direct hit on pathogens, where L is like a lesser hit. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, so I think of that cartoon character comes out guns a-blazing. That's D-lactic acid, and L-lactic acid is a character that comes out with like a water gun. It will irritate some people, may irritate some pathogens, but it's not strong enough to get rid of them. But this one has D-lactic acid, so it's pretty strong.
Okay. Yeah.
This specific.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. So you can see the pathobionts are a little bit higher on this one.
Yeah, the count is also higher, by 4 times almost. So, I mean, that's a significant difference, and interesting to consider. I like to promote lactobacillus in gut health quite heavily. One of the things we're doing is producing kefir grains. Lactobacilli have the ability to signal the immune system by way of dietary tryptophan to control fungi, raising IL-22. That's a major issue also applied to vaginal flora, of course. I haven't seen research regarding vaginal flora and that tryptophan connection. But you know, when you back to the kefir, I mean, people are even using kefir as direct application to balance vaginal flora. I like to think that possibly whey might be a good choice. The kefir whey itself is high in lactoferrin. Let's save that talk for part 2 of our discussion. But this is just fascinating to consider that there may be too much of a good thing here with this higher diversity. You know, and in this case, it's also including higher counts.
And I will say Lactobacillus crispatus, just because you said too much of a good thing, it made me think of it. There are situations that Lactobacillus crispatus can dominate so much that it can cause issues. The environment becomes too acidic, and women can have symptoms from that.
Okay.
I think it's cytolytic vaginosis. I can't think of the exact term, but that is something too. So if you feel, if there is a woman that does a test and she comes out with extremely high Lactobacillus crispatus and she has some symptoms, we do give information about that it is possible that you can have such an overgrowth of crispatus that it can cause some symptoms.
Fascinating. Too much of a good thing. Wow. And pH is so crucial to to the gut as well, because most people may not be familiar with how pH happens to be associated with butyrate synthesis. That's another reason. I mean, the lactobacilli are producing acetate and lactate, which are cross-feeding the butyrate producers, but they're also regulating pH with those short-chain fatty acids. So vaginal pH. Go ahead.
I was going to say that the vaginal pH sits around, we're a healthy level around 4.1 to 4.5.
Okay. All right.
And so some gynecologists will test for bacterial vaginosis just by testing the pH.
Okay. Wow. And low pH is probably more of a problem than high pH in this situation. Would that hold true?
Well, high pH is really can be an indicator of symptoms.
Yeah, in fact, I meant the opposite. High pH, rather. Yeah. A more alkaline vaginal pH is more problematic, similar to what appears to be the case with the gut.
Right.
pH is fascinating. It's also, that it's temperature sensitive. So maybe these cryogenics that we see, people dunking themselves in cold water, could also affect vaginal flora. We know it changes levels of akkermansia, for instance. Okay, let's go through a couple photos real fast because we're running short on time here. This is one of our photos posted September 2022 showing the differences in lactobacilli based on different mammals. So mammalian lactobacilli, fascinating subject. Why should it be 60% of the small intestine of rodents, but in humans, in the small intestine, up to 6%? There's debate there. I like to think that when we see very low levels of lactobacilli in stool testing, that could be suggestive of low levels in the small intestine as well, even though it's a fecal test, more about colonic flora. Now I'm going to also be thinking about how that might relate to vaginal flora. Large intestine, 25% in rodents, lactobacilli, according to this one study, but only 0.3% in humans. Whereas vaginal flora, up to 95% in humans. That's just crazy. Because in other mammals, vaginal flora only 1%, as mentioned, according to this research, whereas they break it down for humans 70%. That's why we can't do research with things like monkeys and mice when it comes to vaginal flora. It's just not going to work.
No.
I just wanted to share this real quickly. I posted this in 2012, thinking about microbiota as a predisposition for adverse vaccine reaction and how that's just not being factored. So this is going back now over almost 11 years this year, where we're talking about translocation of vaginal flora to the uterus, and that's been shown in research also. So I've been tracking this for a while. Here's the motif study. I just posted this today. That is the study that is out of Massachusetts General Hospital that I mentioned earlier. And that stands for Modifying Organisms Transvaginally in Females. So this is really pioneering work by scientists in Boston.
And it's needed. Bacterial vaginosis accounts for, I think the last estimate was 10 to 15 million doctors' visits in the US a year. And
Wow.
that's impressive. And
Yeah.
not to all the pregnancy or infertility issues that it could possibly help with. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Lastly, I just wanted to mention C-section and how that is, of course, associated with changes in microbiota of the infant, of the newborn, and I think it really comes down to antibiotics. The more I look at this subject, and especially obliteration of Bacteroides, which is an immunomodulatory microbe. So that's why I want to learn more about presence of Bacteroides in vaginal flora. What a fascinating subject overall. I want to thank you, Kimberly, so much for being here today.
Oh, you're so welcome.
To see you.
I learn from you all the time, so I appreciate being on here.
Well, you know, you're offering the world such a wonderful way to monitor their health and be proactive. I mean, there are a lot of great self advocates that are active in the Gut Club. I'm so inspired by people, but you're giving us the tools to do that. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for having me, Keith.
Is there anything else we want to talk about before we wrap this up? What do you want to say to people about ordering their test, and how long it takes to get the results? You know.
Oh, it's very simple. I mean, some women have not. If you've done the gut test, you know, you can take it within minutes and ship it off. The vaginal one is quite the same. Nothing too intrusive. It's just going to take a swab and then send it in, and then you should within 2 weeks or less get your results back. Like I said, you will be allocated to a certain community type, and we'll provide for you as much information as we can on what the bacteria that's dominating your system, what associations there are, what lifestyle factors that could influence and maybe help drive, if you're in acute state 4, drive the more beneficial bacteria up, a recommended probiotic based on the research. We really do just provide everything based on the research. We don't speak where the research doesn't speak.
Right. You know, I like to say you can't kill your way to good health. You have to add life. And that speaks toward our protective bacteria. That's where I put a lot of weight when it comes to looking at gut tests. You can't really micromanage things so much. I like to look at the bigger picture. And with vaginal flora, the bigger picture is plain as day. We're talking about lactobacillus dominance all the way. That's again, the guardians of humanity. Unbelievable. Okay. Yeah. So you're in Austin, Texas. I want to say thank you for joining us, and from Palm Beach County with love.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay. We will see you soon in cyberspace, Kimberly.
Sounds good, Keith.
Okay. The Gut Club out. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Take care. Have a great day.